You know, I think that when I think of hiring excellence and what it means to me, I think that I really love to see when humans are deeply considered in something that can be very analytical.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm Shannon Ogborn, your host, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO and beyond. I am so excited and could not be more excited to have Jeremy Lyons here as our 25th guest on the podcast, or should I say 25th episode of the podcast. If you've been on LinkedIn and you've looked at RecOps content or are part of Slack channels talking about RecOps, you've likely seen Jeremy's name pop up. Jeremy is a tireless advocate for RecOps and TAOps and has really helped bring a lot more awareness to the profession along with others in the space. He is the co-founder of RecOps Collective, chief editor of RecOps Roundup, the only weekly RecOps specific newsletter, builder of RecOps, the most popular RecOps focused GPT and OpenAI store, and on top of all of that, a community organizer for our Ashby RecOps community Slack, as well as doing some community work for Candidate FYI. He's also endeavoring to create an in-person RecOps conference at the end of the year. So if RecOps is your thing and you're interested in that, hit us up, let us know. But Jeremy, I am just so excited and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me here, Shannon. I just realized kind of off that intro, it's like, what happens if you say RecOps 3 times fast? Like
nothing good.
Well, summon us like Beetlejuice is the real question.
Exactly. We're here, right? So I would love if you could give our listeners some background on yourself, mostly about like your current work.
Yeah, definitely. So I think whenever anybody always says, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? It's always a tough question. And I think that that's natural for those of us in this position where we do so much. Like where do we find our identity? So you did a great intro for me. I think one of the kind of just couple of other sprinkles I'd add in there is I've been in the recruiting space since birth. My mother was an executive recruiter. I only got into it professionally about 6+ years ago. I've seen a lot in that time. I've been through integrations. I've been through layoffs. I've been through failed S1s that make things very notable and all of that. But I think key to all of that is I've worked with some really amazing people, have an amazing internal board of advisors that I can bounce ideas off of, you being one of them. And, really the only part that's missing is that right now I am working on a contract with G Fiber, where I am helping to build out sort of the job description program, which I think is a really interesting project that they have going there. And I get to work with some incredibly bright recruiting operations people on that team.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, if there's one thing we do know, it's how important job descriptions are to getting the right candidates in the process, making it inclusive. So I love that you're doing that work. I would love if you could tell us just kind of in your experience in the RecOps space, because that is your area of expertise.
Yeah.
What do you feel like has really been the biggest opportunity for improvement?
I think that that's a really great question. And I think one of the really fascinating parts about where we're at right now in the RecOps journey, there are plenty of other people who are talking about this as well. You've got your James Colinos, your Luke Eatons, folks like that, where people are really talking about not only the changing tools, but the changing mindsets, the people that are involved, everything that's going into it. You're seeing a lot more people who are maybe outside of recruiting, getting into recruiting or helping to build recruiting products. So you're seeing a lot more of other ideas kind of coming into the more operational aspect of recruiting operations. And I think one of the biggest areas, especially when we start talking about the usage of AI and the uses of AI for RecOps is people being literate in AI, know what biases might be introduced because of the LLMs where the models have been trained, but also not forgetting that people are involved here. And with people, you have different cultures coming in. What is being built as a tool in one culture might not work in another culture, and especially it might not work internationally, whether it be laws, whether it be just how the thing operates to begin with. So I think that is kind of going to be the biggest opportunity for improvement is how do we make sure that the technology sort of matches the people involved, and how are we going to make sure that sort of one culture isn't valued or given precedent over another culture within this technology or within sort of how we do recruiting operations.
Yeah, it's such a good point. There's so many factors that go into creating a process. And if you're not focusing on how every culture could impact your process, then I think you're really doing candidates and your organization a disservice. Can you talk a little bit about why this is so important in the context of recruiting process?
So I think it's really important, namely because recruiting is a people business, and we have to remember that we can design the most brilliant and fluid process known to man, but ultimately people are going to have to go through it. And one of the things that I think is the biggest piece that we all seem to forget is that to two people, a process that looks really straightforward and looks really easy is not going to be that. It's not going to capture certain elements. It's not going to capture certain even cultural values. And so I think one of the pieces that we have to remember within recruiting operations is you can do everything right and still be wrong. And that is, I think, a unique challenge to recruiting operations. I think that it's a unique challenge to the people who think about this. And then I also think that, when you're trying to build any kind of process, you have to sort of think beyond sort of the immediate aspects, and how are you going to incorporate other ideas? How is this process going to be evolving? Because not everything is set in stone. And I think the minute we probably have all seen it, you start to try and set some stuff in stone, and you leave no room for flexibility. And then when you have to go and change it, it's a lot harder to change.
Yes, you make a good point about the set in stone thing, because I think just like everything, culture evolves too. And so you really have to keep your eye on the ball and make sure you're evolving with culture, with external factors, with the economic environment. Everything can change at the drop of a dime, and you have to be able to adjust, because the companies that have the best processes are the ones that continuously improve their processes. What do you think?
No, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think that's why a model as sort of lift and shift, or when you're copying another company, I think we saw it over the past couple. Well, I wouldn't say past couple of years, but probably about 4 or 5 years ago, especially when I was starting my RecOps career. A lot of people were talking about, oh, well, we have to have bar raiser interviews. And everybody sort of assumed that if you just put in and installed bar raisers, that it was going to work. And so RecOps people ran down that aisle and tried to do it. And I think one of the things that people didn't talk about at that time, and then ended up talking about later, was, well, it really worked for Amazon because it was so deeply entrenched in Amazon's culture. And that's, I think, some piece that oftentimes can get ignored a little bit within recruiting operations, especially at an international level, is that companies have certain elements that are not the words on the wall, are not the company values, but the deep-seated held beliefs by the people who are employees at the company. And how does that permeate through? And how do teams also interpret the cultures that they're bringing in. And you've had guests talk about like, how do you build a neurodivergent culture? How do you build inclusive cultures? How do you do that? And I think there are elements, I'm getting this now because of all of the job description pieces, learned it from Jim Miller at Ashby, is that each job description, each word that you choose has meaning, it has weight, and it gives thought to everything that you're thinking. And that is also an element of recruiting operations where we have to be very measured, because sometimes we just get ideas and we go, this is not going to work. But somebody's sitting there going, you still got to do it. And if you try to fight it uphill the entire time, you're just not going to be successful in recruiting operations. Or maybe you will be, because maybe that's the culture of the company, and that's just what they like to hear out of their people.
Totally. And we'll get to internal culture as a consideration and maybe how to work around that here in a bit. But I would love if you could speak to one thing that we had actually talked about, which was how international culture extends to intersectionality. What is it? What does it mean? What does it mean in the context of this topic? And I think these are the really important pieces where we kind of want to lose the jargon a little bit and speak in a way that allows people to really understand.
Yeah. So one of the things, and it's such a good point, because I hadn't thought about international cultures in building an international company with an international influence and intersectionality until you and I had talked about it end of last year, early this year, as I was getting ready to go on a trip to Japan. And Japan is very much my happy place. And so then I dived in and started reading some more articles. I thought Lauren Starr wrote a great article about translating intersectionality into recruitment language for inclusive hiring. Highly suggest people read that article. It was on LinkedIn. It does a great job of kind of showing how and why words matter, and how just small subtle shifts can also change mindsets. And I think the other piece that is very important when we start talking about international cultures and intersectionality talking kind of about some of the biases that come into play with language, with people, is that even when you have a specific language, and I oftentimes talk about this with people, anybody who will listen to me, the English is a precision language. We pick words for very specific meanings. Other languages don't have that. I mean, English is one of the most populous words when it comes to languages. We've got something like 140 some thousand words, 47,000 words that are obsolete. So you're looking at like almost 200,000 words. Some languages only have 40,000, and you use words to mean different things. That's why. And maybe not so much English, but other languages tie their culture to their words. And people within those cultures use their words very differently, whether you're male or female, whether you're of a status, the different socio status than another person, or whether you're service industry to somebody who's not in the service industry. And I think that's why you have more people speaking Klingon than you have people speaking Esperanto. You cannot separate language from culture, and those biases that are built in intrinsically to language and culture will carry over into what things are talking about and how people talk about things or put forward ideas. I mean, just thinking about the years that I studied Japanese, between service industry people and other groups, you have almost an entire conjugation language within Keigo. Women use words very differently than men use words. And it doesn't mean that anything's wrong with that, but it means that when you go and you start to build process and you start to build recruiting elements to it, you have to be sensitive to the fact that words are going to be used differently. Cultures are going to bring in different ideas, especially within Japanese. It's a strong innovation society. And those strong innovation society means you're probably not going to hear native Japanese people voicing discontent in the same way that you hear it in English. when I was living there, you'd hear people say, ooh, that's difficult. And when you heard that, that was a no. But if we hear that in English, we're like, oh, it's difficult. Cool. Let me just solution on this and make it
Right.
happen. And it's really like, well, you had to read between the lines
Totally.
for it.
So that's a really interesting consideration on international hiring. What other considerations, if any important considerations, would you say people should be thinking about if they are taking a route of international hiring or setting up processes for international hiring?
Yeah. So, and this is the former teacher in me coming out. I think when people start trying to hire internationally, it becomes a very like, let's just go and make some hires aspect. It's very driven. And I think where that fails and why it's important is you have to start with education. You can start by looking in your own network to see, do you have any people who used to live in the country that you're planning on expanding into and going and looking at. Great example of that. I was talking with another RecOps person actually in Ashby's Slack channel who was like, how do you go about hiring in Japan? What job boards am I going to use? And it just coincided happily with a trip. And when I was there, I asked every single one of my friends, where do your Japanese friends go and search for jobs? How do they like to interview? How do you do all those things just to get some knowledge base and build a consensus sort of idea? Because if you start with the educational aspects of things, you'll be able to sort of see things around corners beyond just the like, hey, I'm showing up with a job. And I think that being able to do that and being able to understand how cultures also recruit each other and the perceptions in market are not things that you're going to get from just talking to candidates, where candidates are like, I'm trying to give you my best impression, but it will allow you sensitivities, and it will, I think, especially on the recruiting operations side, it allows your recruiting operations side to also take on a different angle of talent intelligence, being also viewed as a research function and grabbing information, not only at an international level, because, if you're an international company, you're competing against another international company, you can't just sort of view what they're doing in the US. You have to think about it broadly and see you can do so much more if you're kind of taking in those international influences and then using those influences on maybe things that you like and want to bring into the US.
Totally. I mean, it sounds like a big piece of international hiring is really being able to, in terms of the process setup, find experts and leverage them so that you can have a process that is going to work for the cultures that you're hiring. And that's super important, going to be inclusive for the cultures you're hiring. Tell me a little bit more tactically about how people should go about finding experts and leveraging them.
Yeah. So, I mean, exactly kind of how I mentioned to, dive into your network, dive into the communities that sort of exist around things, reaching out to organizations and associations that are also touching on maybe where you're going, maybe around the culture. I think this is oftentimes not necessarily a place where people go to learn in their home countries, because most of these organizations exist kind of all over in some capacity and are great bastions for expat people as well, which I think is really good. I think looking at doing like an inventory study on your own culture and then seeing where there might be conflicts abroad. When I sort of think about that, I think about earlier in my career when I was at Verizon Media, there was kind of a idea that, hey, the home office is going to come up with, like, the US will come up with the idea, we will send the idea out, and then we're just sort of expecting the idea to work in Europe and the idea to work in Asia. And I would get on calls with those teams and I'd say, well, how do you interpret this idea? How are we going to make this idea work? And I think that could have all been sort of scaled back, and maybe it was happening and I just didn't know, where you sit down and you very tactically draw out the lists around everything. And then, again, a lot of people have talked about this and it cannot be overstated. just how important talking to your own ERGs are, not tokenizing your ERGs, not making sure your ERGs are like, hey, I'm just using you to use you, but really deeply involving your ERGs. It can be extending to, hey, these are some interview questions we're thinking about asking. This is how we're thinking about going forward. Give me your opinion and genuinely listen to it. Because I think there's a lot of times where people talk in, especially DEI circles, where you're just, people are saying like, oh, well, your ERG will help with that. And you're telling people a lot of things where maybe they don't want to be. So getting their input, getting their feedback on everything. And then kind of last but not least, like, consider your company culture. There are going to be, as much as you might want to expand internationally, you might not have the kind of company culture that will allow you to expand into multiple time zones or take on international influences or be ready to take on international influences at your current stage. And that doesn't mean you can't evolve to get there, but it's something that you should consider, because otherwise, when you're trying to find people, they'll come and they'll go very quickly. And certain countries have extended leave periods and things like that. And those rules change. And those are things you have to be aware of.
Definitely. I love several things you said, including about the ERGs. ERGs can be a great resource, but no one at your organization in an ERG should ever feel like you are tokenizing them or forcing them to give you their opinion. And honestly, I'm a big advocate for paying people for their consultative time on these things. Like, you should be paying people for their time on these things if it's outside of their work parameters. That's my opinion. Maybe that's getting to a hot take early.
I mean, I don't think that that's a hot take. I think that one of the things that, and this is, you bring up an excellent point there. You can build a lot of goodwill in your own community by being a company that says, hey, let's go talk to this association to find out this group of people that we're planning on hiring. We can make a donation here. And those groups oftentimes need funding. And what looks better than to say, hey, we're giving you the opportunity to tell us about your culture. We're exchanging goods with this. And it might just be as simple as saying, hey, you could put our logo up here, and that might help the company as well, or the company or the association or the alumni group or any of those things expand. And maybe they've just been limited. So now you're not only helping your community, you're endearing goodwill, because they can say, oh my God, these are people who want to work with us. This is where we can offer things. And, that so much of everything, especially internationally, is relationship building. A lot of people will not leave their jobs unless they feel like they have a great relationship with the people that they're going to be moving from one place to another with.
I don't know about you, but I feel like in terms of building that trust and having that certain type of, attachment or excitement to work, America is actually more of an anomaly of how people view work, instead of I don't want to say a rule, but more of a trend across other countries. America, I feel like, is actually an anomaly in how people view work, get jobs, and interview. So putting that as the forefront and primary, I feel like is just not like a good way to do things if you're hiring anyone from any different cultures, which in America you still are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a beautiful point, and it touches on so many key things that can impact your company from an international standpoint as well. Because for America, so much of our identity is tied into the work that we do, and you hear about, job seekers right now. Job seeking is a full-time job. That's verbiage and wording and ideas that came up kind of in the last 2-3 years. You also see, and I've written on this, a Kubler-Ross type loss stage thing that people go through in their job search. And that has an incredible impact on mental health. And I think what we've seen from other countries kind of influencing the US's culture, and I would argue this very positively, is other countries, when you are on PTO, you are on PTO. When you have, I was going to say bereavement leave, you are on bereavement leave. When
And you
you
have
are,
it.
what?
And you would just have it. You have it. We don't have it
Yeah,
here
yeah, you
as
just
a
have it.
standard anyway.
Yeah. Or, I mean, even like when I think about kind of how you and I got introduced and the work that you and I have done and together, maternity leave. I mean, there are some countries where you're going to get like a full year. And we're
And it's
starting to,
expected.
and it's yeah, it's expected. And now we're starting to see a lot of companies come out with maternity leave coverage that's 20 months, 24 months, or, or sorry, not months, weeks. But like you're starting to see companies go, actually, we have an obligation to view these people as people. And ultimately, the social good is going to be in the outcome and not necessarily show up on a P&L line where it's all about just the output. And I think in the US, we tend to be very focused on the output as opposed to thinking about it more holistically.
I absolutely, to your point, think that international influences have a very positive impact on the way Americans work. I'm curious, this is sort of like a little bit of a curveball question. Do you think that you can apply the same interview process across, like, let's just say like general interview process, right? Obviously, technical roles are different from non-technical roles and things like that. But do you think that you can apply that across all countries you're hiring in?
I don't. And I mean, I think that if you look at the base parts of what an interview is, which is asking questions, then yeah, that's not going to change. If people need to ask questions, because especially if you're submitting a resume, you're only going to see so much. You need to validate that what you're asking is true. I think that you can't just go, this is going to work everywhere, and not take into account the cultural significances of the things you're asking. I mean, one of the things that I take great joy in is for the JET program, I still do interviews. And we do the interviews in the US, but because it is for a Japanese company, or really it's for the Japanese government, we're able to ask certain things on the application that we can't ask in the US. And we're able to ask certain questions that are not able to, we have to.
Mm-hmm.
But those are questions that are very traditional to Japanese jobs. Do I think that that's going to carry over into the US? No. But do I think that there are certain jobs in other countries where those kinds of questions that are like, you see that you've marked yes to having a disability. Can you tell us more about it? Those are things where it opens up the conversation a little bit. Does it?
This just kind of jogged a point. When you think about it, if you wouldn't take a different culture, like say you hire in America primarily and you're looking to hire internationally, if you wouldn't take that one culture and apply it across all of your roles and jobs, why would you expect it to work the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's oftentimes the simplest questions that get the biggest reactions. And I think that what you just said right there is sometimes you just have to take things back to a very simple first principle type question, which is exactly what you just said.
I just blew my own mind because I had never really thought of that before.
This is why I love every single time we talk, is I feel like I learn a ton across the board. And I think that it carries. I think if you are an international citizen of the world, you're trying to learn from everybody that you talk to, because what you just said could actually, a week from now, really drive an impact for me on who knows. Maybe I'm just going to parrot what you just said as a question to somebody else. And I think that that's the beautiful part about getting other ideas, bringing in those ideas to the table. I mean, I just did a whole series for my own newsletter where I was talking about like, here's a Japanese word and concept that you can apply over here, and it will carry. It's one of the, I would say it's an international concept that carries across. But those are things that I think that are really important. Those things, concepts can carry. I don't think you can, again, take one process and move it across everything and have it work.
Totally. But that's what a lot of companies try to do. It's easier, the data's cleaner, and all of these things, right? All these considerations that make things easier and more efficient. But are you doing right by candidates? Are you doing right by your organization? Are you building an inclusive and diverse culture? That's kind of like the jury's out when people apply the same process across everything. So I think these are all really positive considerations for people to think about as they go into hiring outside of their, let's just say, like, dominant HQ headquarter.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you just talked about it there. Like, I think sometimes people get scared that you're not going to see the same data across the board because people get very comfortable looking at numbers. And I mean, I think we all like to look at dashboards. I think even on our health apps, we're like, ooh, I got 20 more steps here
Yeah.
than, whatever. We like the performance metrics that show us up. But I think that there's a lot that you can't measure. And it's that those items between the lines that are data points that we miss out on. And, maybe we get them in surveys, and survey data has always been hard to get from people.
But you just have to balance the data element with the human element. There's no world where you can only do one, in my opinion, and have a successful recruiting process,
Yeah.
or the best process that you can have, rather.
I mean, all the best processes are built on new ideas coming into the fold and bringing those up. And I think one of the elements that makes recruiting operations hard is that, in year one, you can gather all of the ideas and put in the processes that you think are going to be in play and measure those in year two. And then in year three, you're looking at it and going, okay, did that work? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that. Sometimes it happens really, really quick. But I think an often thing that gets overlooked is new people come and go. We're not seeing people in the same. If you are lucky enough to be at a company where you can be there for 3 years straight, then great. You'll be able to measure impact because of the things. But we're seeing companies do layoffs faster. We're seeing people leave for newer jobs faster. We're seeing all of this change. And the minute you start putting processes into play, now you got to go and get stakeholder management or stakeholder approval. And when those stakeholders change, people want to bring in their own ideas. So
Yes.
it is a part that makes our job really hard to balance. And I think that's, something we measured in all of it.
Yeah. On that sort of topic, in sort of like zooming out,
Yeah.
we talk a lot about hiring excellence at Ashby. And like what we were just talking about was very in line with how do you hire excellently. I'm curious, from that perspective, when you hear hiring excellence, what does that mean to you?
Oh, hiring excellence is a really great topic. And I know that when Jim laid out that framework in that article in November, I read it. I thought it was super comprehensive. What does it mean to me? I think that when I think of hiring excellence and what it means to me, I think that I really love to see when humans are deeply considered in something that can be very analytical, and that something that is very analytical also considers the human elements. And I think when those two things kind of meet together, everybody finds the why in sort of why they're hiring and sees the bigger picture. And I think there's oftentimes kind of an imbalance at companies why we're hiring. I think Leah, I'm going to butcher her last name, Kebler.
Oh, Leia Nobler.
No, thank you. I mean, I really liked what she had said, where it's, we're very transparent with our hiring and we talk about why we didn't do this or didn't do that. I think that that's an element to hiring excellence, is that everybody knows exactly why. That can't be overlooked.
Totally. Totally. I love all of that. I'm like so eager to get to your recruiting hot take. I mean, let's be honest, 90% of our conversations are about recruiting hot takes. So, I'm excited to have your published version of what is your recruiting hot take?
I mean, I hope no one ever hacks any of our conversations, because the gold mine of information in there would be very, very fascinating to see. And I know that some people like it hot. I like it spicy, and that's why, every Thursday or every other Thursday I post, a spicy take. I think my spiciest take right now is that RecOps is easy. It isn't easy. It is a field, like I mentioned at the top, that you could do everything right and still be wrong. People and processes that are nuanced and extremely dependent on company cultures. So you can't just sort of say, hey, this worked at Stripe and it's going to work at, Ashby. And I think that because of that, a lot of people think that they can do recruiting operations because they've used an ATS or they've used this sort of process and it's going to work. And I think the best thing to say is that RecOps is really easy to get wrong, and you will end up unpacking it. And RecOps people end up unpacking a lot of things very often, whether that is going into the data and finding out, hey, we've had all of these different exceptions and now we go, that wasn't an exception, that was a process, and now we got to omit all of this data. Or you look at a process and you just go, how on earth did we get here? And so I think that my spiciest take is that it doesn't mean that not everybody can get into recruiting operations. I think that it is a multidisciplinary field. I think that there are ways to do it right, and you can, again, do everything right and still get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. It definitely, to your point, culture of a company is such an important consideration anytime you're building processes, and that's why copy and paste is just simply not going to work for RecOps, like, at all. And I find the best RecOps people are the people who go into an organization. If they're going into a new organization, they evaluate the culture, they evaluate the current process, they really think critically about, like, what's going to fit with this organization and how is this different than what I've done before, and how is it the same, and how can I apply what I learned before but in a way that's going to work here. That includes process, that includes tools, that includes team makeup, it includes all the things.
I think the other part, I have another spicy take too.
Oh my gosh, he's on fire.
I think one of the things as we talk about AI is we have to realize AI is not there yet. And what we have been using to train AI is not exactly perfect material.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see reports that say AI is running out of material to learn from, we have to remember that the material that has been training the AI is also carrying through bias.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there was a report that came out that says, like, AI is biased. And I look at that and I go, of course it is.
Yeah, duh.
How could it not be?
AI, when you use AI needs a babysitter, and
Yeah.
you are the sitter.
Yeah. And I mean, and you have to course correct it, because if you don't, it's using the information that's out there, and there's nothing to say, like, don't use this. Like,
I mean,
know
humans
it.
are inherently biased. We know this. It is using human-made content to create new content. Humans have biases, so the new content has the potential for that as well. So just know that if you're using AI in recruiting or otherwise, you are the babysitter. You are there to say, I need to correct this because I know that there is a bias here. It's not easy. But it's going to be the case. I think we are coming up on our time here. I love all these hot takes. This has been so amazing. Where should people go to learn more about you and your work so they can follow your future hot takes?
So you can follow me on LinkedIn. Jeremy A. Lyons. I have the A in there so that I know when people are using a token. You can follow RecOps Collective. You can also follow the newsletter. It's on Substack. It's on LinkedIn. That comes out once a week. I have a very tight posting schedule. So if you want to see some more hot takes and spicy takes, it is Thursdays every week. Yep. Ultimately, shoot me messages. I'm very easy to find and I will respond to all of them.
Yay. We love that. We love a responsive person. Well, Jeremy, all I can say is thank you for being such a critical piece of my success in my role. It's been so great to work with you, and it's a pleasure to have had you here today. Just excited to have our conversations that are usually on Zoom or Slack in a public space, so other people can hopefully enjoy them too. So thanks so much again for joining us on Offer Accepted. We really appreciate you spending time with us. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.